Kindness attracts toxic people. The desire to help others is not always safe. Two friends learned this the hard way. They could never have imagined that a simple trip to a local video store would leave one of them on the brink of death and take the life of the other. The reason for it all was their genuine kindness and willingness to help others. And before we get started, be kind enough to support my channel. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and stay active. It will help a lot. I will be very grateful to you for that. Let's get started. Today's story took place in a small town called Dover in Tuscarawas County, Ohio, where just over 12,000 people lived at the turn of the new millennium. This small town borders New Philadelphia, the administrative center of Tuscarawas County, and is located about 100 kilometers south of Cleveland. On May 25, 2000, a Thursday, around 1:30 a.m., a tired police officer was driving home from his shift when he noticed a strange figure stumbling along the roadside. At first, he thought it was some late-night reveler, as there was a bar nearby. It wasn't surprising that the person was swaying from side to side, barely able to move their unsteady legs. The law enforcement officer decided to pull over and check if everything was all right and if the passerby needed help. As the officer approached the figure in the darkness, he realized it wasn't a drunken bar patron, but a small, fragile teenage girl who, upon seeing the police car, began screaming hysterically and waving her arms. The officer stopped and noticed that the girl was soaking wet, barefoot, and beaten. Between her sobs, he could only make out that the schoolgirl had been in the river, and although she was in bad shape herself, she was more concerned about her friend's fate. The officer did his best to calm the girl, helped her into the car, gave her a chance to warm up, and drove her to a safe place. On the way, he tried to get more useful information from her, but the teenager, in a state of hysteria, couldn't say a word. The schoolgirl only cried and worried about her friend. However, what the officer learned was enough to understand that something terrible had happened to the two girls. The victim's name was Brandy Higgs. She was 18 years old. Her best friend, 17-year-old Liz Reiser, was missing. Elizabeth Kinsey Reiser was born on March 20th, 1983. She was the eldest and only daughter. Besides Liz, Becky and Jeff Reiser had 3 sons. From childhood, the girl was surrounded by love and affection and was herself generous, kind, and friendly to everyone around her. She smiled at everyone she met and greeted even strangers. Elizabeth was an ordinary teenager living her own life. She loved Mountain Dew, Dalmatians, and the TV show Rugrats. Liz worried about school dances, her appearance, getting her driver's license, and her high school diploma. She dreamed of graduating high school and starting an independent adult life. Her friends, family, and everyone who knew her adored her, saying that even at 17, when teenagers often become a bit selfish, Elizabeth was one of those girls who always thought of others. She was friendly and always ready to lend a helping hand to anyone in need. Unfortunately, her caring nature and kind heart led to tragedy. She trusted someone who didn't deserve it. On the night when Elizabeth's friend, Brandy Higgs, was picked up on the road by a police officer driving home from his shift, it was 1:30 a.m. At 3:45 in the morning, there was a knock at the Reisers' door. Their 12-year-old son, Liz's brother, whose room was closest to the front door, was the first to react to the knock. He got out of bed and looked out the window. Seeing a police officer on the porch, the boy calmly unlocked the door. When asked if his sister Elizabeth was home, the child only rubbed his eyes in confusion. Still half asleep, he couldn't understand why an officer needed him at such an early hour. The boy slammed the door shut, ran upstairs to his parents' bedroom, Becky and Jeff, and tugging at his father's shoulder, whispered anxiously that the police were looking for Elizabeth. This wasn't their son's nightmare, it was their real-life reality. Not understanding anything in their groggy state, the parents went downstairs and heard the heartbreaking news. Their daughter Liz was missing, and her friend Brandy Higgs had fallen into the river. At first, the parents thought it was some kind of mistake. They knew that Liz was supposed to spend the night at Brandy's. The high school girls had planned a pajama party, and to avoid returning in the dark, their daughter had said she would stay at her best friend's house. And now they were being told that Liz was missing. How could this be possible? At that moment, the parents were utterly confused. They didn't understand what was happening. Becky, Liz's mother, immediately rushed to her daughter's bedroom to check if she had come home. As the woman climbed the stairs to the room, a sense of fear began to grow in her heart. Her legs and arms trembled involuntarily. Seeing the slightly open door and Liz's neatly made bed, Becky realized her daughter wasn't there. The woman still looked inside and saw the usual mess. Elizabeth was like a tornado. She could spend half a day cleaning her room and then destroy everything in a matter of seconds. It was her bad habit. Whenever Liz was getting ready to go somewhere, her entire bedroom would be turned upside down. Finding that her daughter wasn't in the room, Becky returned to the porch where her husband Jeff and the police officer were waiting. The officer told the parents that a couple of hours earlier, Brandy Higgs, their daughter's best friend, had been found on a dark road a few kilometers from town by a law enforcement officer. The high school girl was soaking wet and bleeding. She said she ended up there against her will. They had been attacked. It was she who confessed to the officer that she didn't know where Liz was or what had happened to her. Brandy had been taken to the nearest hospital. That was all the information the officer had at the time. He had come to the Risers' house with one sole purpose: to find out if their daughter had returned home another way. Elizabeth's disappearance became the worst nightmare for her family. In the past, her parents rarely let her spend the night at a friend's house, but that day they allowed her to stay at Brandy's because it was the last few school days before graduation. And now, this leniency had backfired on them. Becky felt that morning that something bad had happened. Liz was an exemplary, obedient child. Both she and Brandy came from very religious families. They attended church regularly and led a very upright lifestyle. The girls weren't the type of teenagers who got into trouble. Becky assured the officer that as soon as Liz returned home, she would scold her for bad behavior. But deep down, the mother knew it wasn't true, that something was wrong. The woman thanked the officer for his concern and closed the door. However, the parents couldn't sleep that night. The mother and father didn't know where to look for their daughter. All they could do was pray for a positive outcome and for Liz to return home safe and sound. Jeff, Elizabeth's father, sat on the couch and began reading the Bible. It somehow helped him distract himself from what was happening. Meanwhile, Becky went upstairs and paced from window to window, looking out to see if her child would appear on the horizon. The woman imagined Liz's familiar figure emerging from around the corner, calling the police station to joyfully report that everything was fine. But hours passed, and Elizabeth didn't return. The police officer, who had promised to provide any additional information, didn't call either. The parents' hope faded around 6 in the morning. They could no longer sit at home and simply wait, with no news about their child. So Jeff and Becky decided to go to the hospital where their daughter's friend Brandy had been taken, hoping to find out any details about Liz's disappearance. When the Risers arrived at the hospital, they were sent to the waiting room, where the Higgs family was already sitting. Everyone sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Suddenly, at some point, Jeff, Liz's father, had a clear realization of the situation. It was like a flash. He suddenly understood that his daughter was dead. Earlier, at home, sitting on the couch, he had randomly opened the Bible to a certain page and read a passage from Matthew. "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." Even then, the thought had crept into his mind that his daughter was no longer alive. Now, sitting in the hospital, he was fully convinced that his premonition hadn't deceived him, as much as he didn't want it to be true. It's worth noting that at that moment, no one yet knew what had happened to Elizabeth. But soon, the Risers received confirmation of their grim thoughts. Police officers arrived at the hospital and said they had found a body matching Liz's description. They listed the clothing items found on the body. The parents understood everything. They pulled out a photo of their daughter and handed it to the officers for comparison. the mother and father's nightmare became reality. Elizabeth was indeed dead. Now they had to go home and tell their 3 sons that their older sister would never come back. So what happened that night, according to Brandy Higgs? It was Wednesday evening. Liz and Brandy were planning a sleepover. Both were in great spirits. Ahead lay final exams, high school graduation, and stepping into the adult world. A new chapter in their lives was about to begin. The girls were very excited about this. They planned to stay up all night, talking, discussing future plans, and watching an interesting movie. Around 9:30 p.m., Brandy and Liz drove to a video rental store in a shopping center nearby in New Philadelphia. The girls went into the video rental shop together and spent some time looking at movie covers, discussing a church choir concert they had just attended. Finally, the high school girls picked out a couple of suitable movies, wandered around the shopping center, and headed to their car. As soon as they reached the car, a young man, about 25 years old, approached them and asked if they could give him a ride home. The guy seemed only slightly older than them, his dark hair sticking out from under a baseball cap and curling at the sides. He wore glasses and looked like a normal, friendly person you might see on the street. There was nothing in his appearance that raised alarm, but he was a stranger, so the girls looked at each other and laughed, unsure how to respond to his request. Likely sensing the schoolgirls' hesitation, the man reassured them, saying he lived nearby, a 10-minute drive, and if they wanted, he could give them $20 for gas. The stranger just really needed to get home to see his beloved wife and kids before his little ones went to bed. The fact that the man had a wife and small children immediately disarmed the girls. Surely a devoted family man wouldn't harm them. Besides, it was a short drive, and their town was small, where almost everyone knew each other. So Brandy and Liz thought they were safe. The friends discussed the situation and made a decision that turned into a disaster for them. Brandy was driving, Liz sat in the passenger seat, and the man settled in the back. Although the stranger said he lived just 10 minutes away and pointed the way, 15 minutes later, they were still driving. Fewer and fewer houses appeared in sight. The area was becoming deserted. Naturally, the girls got a little nervous as time passed and the distance grew. Brandy asked the stranger how much longer they had to drive. The man reassured her, saying it was just a couple more minutes, that they were almost at his house. But 2 minutes later, and then 5, no house appeared on the horizon. Brandy stopped the car and asked the passenger to walk the rest of the way, as it was late and they needed to get home. What started as a simple act of kindness quickly spiraled out of control. When the girls realized this, it was too late. After Brandy's request for him to get out of the car, the man pulled out a gun and ordered them to keep driving. Exchanging frightened glances, the friends decided to follow his instructions. Then the stranger asked if they had any money, to which they replied no. The girls realized they were being robbed, but they had no valuables with them. Surely this man wasn't actually going to shoot them. Meanwhile, the man instructed Brandy to drive to a remote field about 10 kilometers from town, a place he seemed to know well. Because when they were climbing a hill, the attacker told Brandy to slow down, as the road would be bumpy. When the car reached the top of the hill, they stopped in a remote area with no houses around. The man forced both girls to take off their sneaker laces. With these laces, he ordered Brandy to tie Liz's hands behind her back, then took the second pair of laces and tied Brandy to the steering wheel so tightly that she couldn't move her fingers. When the stranger got out of the car, Brandy looked at her friend and burst into tears. She apologized for getting Liz into trouble. Liz, in turn, said they were both to blame and started crying too. But who could have known that helping someone would turn into a tragedy, the scale of which the girls still didn't comprehend? Their conversation lasted only a few seconds before the man opened the passenger door and ordered Liz to get out. Brandy whispered to her not to worry, that they'd see each other soon, and then watched as the stranger and Elizabeth, with her hands tied, walked away down a path. Tied to the steering wheel, Brandy sat in the car alone. she began to panic because she had no idea what was happening to her friend or what fate awaited her. The subsequent events became known during the police investigation, as Brandy Higgs didn't know why the man took Liz or where she ultimately disappeared to. As soon as Elizabeth Reiser and the stranger reached a small clearing, he forced her to her knees and told her to be quiet. The man smoked a cigarette and thought about what to do next. In reality, he only intended to rob the two schoolgirls, but something went wrong. He didn't have a specific plan. He wasn't planning to take their lives. He needed money, but the girls had no cash. At one point, the man even considered letting Liz go and explain to her how to get back to town. But then he decided it was too late to set her free. The girl would surely run straight to the police and file a report, as Liz had seen his face and could give an accurate description. What happened next was instantaneous. The stranger reached into his pocket and pulled out a small knife with a curved blade. He leaned toward the schoolgirl, saying he would cut the ropes and let her go, but instead, he slashed Elizabeth's throat 3 times. When they later found the girl, she had multiple cuts on her throat that nearly decapitated her. Additionally, the attacker stabbed her 5 times in the head and back, ultimately breaking the knife. So Liz had no chance of survival. After finishing with Elizabeth Reiser, the man walked back to the car where Brandy was sitting. The schoolgirl, seeing the attacker return alone without Liz, became even more terrified. The first thing she asked was where her friend was. Instead of answering, the stranger ordered her to get out of the car, forgetting that he had tied her to the steering wheel. After clumsily untying the knots on the laces, the man led Brandy to the same hill he had just climbed with Liz. At that moment, the high school girl thought her life was over. She was going to die, and she was only 18. Thoughts raced through her mind like the wind. Brandy thought about her parents and all the people close to her. She wondered how her death would affect them. Would they even find the girls' bodies? And would they be angry at her and Elizabeth for letting a stranger get into the car with them? As soon as the victim and her abductor reached the top of the hill, 2 different paths appeared. They could go left or right. The man pushed Brandy to the right. She tried to look the other way and even noticed something in the grass, but at that moment, the attacker grabbed her face and turned it away. In that instant, the schoolgirl didn't even realize she had seen Liz's mangled body, as she hoped in her heart that her friend had managed to escape. After walking another 10 meters or so, the man turned around and headed back to the car. Apparently, he hadn't yet decided what to do with the second girl. He shoved Brandy into the passenger seat and took the driver's seat, first making her take off her socks, which he pulled over his hands like gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints. They drove in silence for a while. Then the man looked at Brandy and casually said he had killed her friend. At that moment, the girl didn't fully grasp the meaning of his words, but her hands began to tremble involuntarily. She stared at a single point on the windshield and didn't say a word. The schoolgirl didn't want to give the attacker any satisfaction, so she held back her tears and the scream rising in her chest. A couple of minutes later, the man looked at her again and said he had just wanted to scare her and see her reaction. But since Brandy didn't react, he admitted that Liz was fine. He had simply explained to Reiser how to get to town and let her go. At that moment, Brandy genuinely believed him and was relieved that at least Liz was safe. But now, she was tormented by the question of what would happen to her. She was about to ask her abductor, but he parked near some railroad tracks and forced her to get out of the car. Then the two of them walked along the tracks. Brandy was terrified, crying, and in pain, while the guy just talked to her and asked questions as if nothing terrible had happened. He asked her about school and college, whether she had a boyfriend, and what her relationship with her parents was like. It was a completely normal conversation, but it was happening in an utterly abnormal situation. Though Brandy didn't want to discuss her personal life with this strange man, she kept the conversation going. She hoped he would take a liking to her and not harm her. After a while, they noticed an old, abandoned freight train car on a siding. The man forced Brandy to go inside. He took her inexpensive jewelry and offered her a chance to earn her life. If she wanted to live, she had to undress. Naturally, Brandy hesitated, but not knowing what else to expect from the stranger, she complied with his demands. The abductor unzipped his pants and made several attempts to commit a sexual act. Fortunately, he failed. But those attempts alone were enough for the girl to feel humiliated and crushed. It felt like she was being tortured for hours. The stranger's touch was so repulsive. Frustrated by his failure, the attacker threw Brandy her clothes and ordered her to get dressed. The high school girl pulled on her pants and sweater, curled up into a ball, and wanted to die right there on the floor of the old train car. She had just been through hell and didn't want to move, breathe, or do anything. But even that wasn't allowed. Afterward, the man forced her to stand up and leave the car to continue their journey. They ended up on a railroad bridge over the Tuscarawas River in New Philadelphia. The attacker ordered the schoolgirl to kneel and face the water, which she did. Standing behind Brandy, the criminal pulled out one of the sneaker laces taken earlier from the girl's, wrapped it around her neck, and began to strangle her. The girl had no idea what was happening. In one moment, she couldn't breathe, and then she lost consciousness. When Brandy came to, the stranger was still standing nearby, looking at the river. He didn't know his captive had regained consciousness. The schoolgirl realized she needed to pretend to be dead. She held her breath when the man approached. First, he jabbed her in the back with his fist, then kicked her, wanting to make sure Brandy was dead. All this time, she managed to convincingly play a lifeless body. Thankfully, it was happening in complete darkness. But the stranger didn't give up and continued beating her. One of the blows was so strong that Brandy couldn't hold back and let out a moan. The man realized she was still alive, sat on top of her, grabbed her head with both hands, and tried to snap her neck. When that didn't work, the criminal began slamming her head against the rails before finally throwing Brandy off the bridge into the river. And then, something happened that neither the girl nor her tormentor expected. Her foot got caught between a metal and wooden structure. As a result, the barely alive Brandy ended up hanging upside down over the water, dangling until the man managed to push her into the river. The high school girl fell headfirst from a height of 9 meters. The water she landed in was full of debris and logs, so she was, in a way, lucky. Brandy didn't hit her head when she fell. She surfaced with her back up and let the current carry her body to a log. The schoolgirl pulled off the same trick again, and it saved her life. While in the water under the bridge, she saw the red glow of a cigarette. The attacker was pacing back and forth, looking down at the water. He threw rocks below, but this time Brandy was far away and didn't give herself away. Finally, the man left. The girl waited a couple more minutes and began slowly making her way to shore. The bank wasn't far, but the water was cold, and her body ached with pain. It took her an eternity. Brandy used every ounce of strength and energy in her body to crawl onto land. Suddenly, fear struck her again. What if the criminal hadn't actually left but was only pretending? The schoolgirl didn't know which way to run, so she moved randomly and soon found herself on a nearby road where she tried to flag down a car. Everyone drove past, probably mistaking her for a vagrant. At that moment, a police officer who had just finished his shift was driving down the highway and picked up the pale, shivering teenager. Once safe, the girl gave in to her tears. She couldn't even properly tell her story. She only remembered constantly talking about her friend Liz. Later, when she fully came to, she told the police the story. The officers were in shock. They couldn't believe some monster had so casually decided to take the lives of 2 innocent high school girls. But there was no time to relax. They still needed to find the second girl, Elizabeth Reiser. Brandy thought she had seen something on the other path, but wasn't sure if it was Liz. The police immediately dismissed the idea that Reiser had been let go. They were firmly convinced that it was her that her friend had seen and immediately went to the place Brandy described. There was still a chance the girl was alive but perhaps unconscious. In that case, she needed urgent medical attention. and even if there was no chance, if Elizabeth was dead, they still needed to find at least her body. The local police teamed up with the Ohio State Police. The search team had a general idea of where Liz and Brandy had been with the man, but they didn't have exact coordinates. The early morning hours began with the search. 2 officers quickly found the bumpy road on the hill and, shining flashlights under every bush, headed down the path. When they finally stumbled upon a mound on the ground, they didn't immediately realize it was a human body. It was the missing high school girl, 17-year-old Elizabeth Reiser. Though it was clear the girl was dead, the police checked her pulse just to be sure. Now they had to investigate 2 crime scenes, the one where Liz's body was found and the other where Brandy was thrown off the railroad bridge. The authorities had little information to track down the person who attacked the 2 high school girls. Of course, Higgs gave the police a description of the man, but it was vague and matched countless young men. A stocky young man, about 25 years old, roughly 175 centimeters tall, with dark, curly hair. He wore glasses with a metal frame and a baseball cap. That was all Brandy could recall, no distinguishing marks. The investigators first assumed the man was local or, for some reason, knew the area well. But that wasn't enough. Though the detectives thought the case might drag on, they solved it quickly. The reason was a phone call with a tip from a woman. She called the police and said her son had taken someone's life. She learned about it from her relative named Jeff Mullenix. The woman's son was 27-year-old Matthew Vaca. The investigators immediately contacted Jeff to learn the details of the conversation, and the man told the following story. Early in the morning on May 25th, around the same time Brandy Higgs was picked up on the road by a police officer, there was a knock at Jeff's door. His relative, Matthew Vaca, was standing on the porch. The young man was very agitated. He asked the man to follow him. They drove around the city in silence for a while until Jeff finally asked what was going on and why he had been woken up so early. Matthew paused for a couple of minutes, then looked at Jeff and said he had stabbed an unfamiliar girl to death. At first, the man didn't believe him because it was such an unexpected statement. Then the guy drove Jeff to the hill and showed him Elizabeth's body. He asked him to look in the grass for the broken piece of the knife, as it likely had his fingerprints on it. Eventually, the men found the blade fragment, put it in a bag with the bloodied clothes, and threw it into the river. After Jeff Mullenix told the police about this, the detectives immediately obtained a warrant, and the next day, Matthew Vaca was arrested. During the investigation, the police realized that Brandy's description perfectly matched Matthew's appearance. When the news of the murder and attempted murder in the small town hit the media, everyone was talking about it. No one could believe that 2 teenage girls who just wanted to have a pajama party went to a video rental store and were attacked, resulting in one losing her life and the other being left to die in the river. The school where Liz and Brandy had recently been preparing for graduation had to bring in a counselor because many students were shaken by the tragedy. Their safe world was shattered, and they felt vulnerable. A memorial dedicated to the 2 friends was set up on the school's flagpole. Elizabeth Reiser's tragic death served as a sobering warning about the risks of trusting a complete stranger. What shocked people the most was how random the crime was. The girls could have refused the stranger and driven away, or someone else could have been in their place. The second shock was that the abductor and murderer turned out to be a local neighbor. It meant that someone so dangerous, aggressive, and ruthless had been living in their community all along. 27-year-old Matthew Vaca was a young husband and father of 3 small children. Few knew that the unassuming family man had a dark side to his personality. Matthew had several run-ins with the law and a lengthy criminal history, including charges of threatening his stepfather's life, forging documents, abusing illegal substances, and threatening to kill his wife with a knife and shotgun. At the time of the attack on the girls, Matthew was on probation for theft and forgery charges. The investigators began looking for evidence to prove Vaca's guilt, but they didn't even have to, as Matthew confessed to almost everything after his arrest. He said he didn't know why he attacked the high school girls. Initially, the man really only intended to rob them when he asked for a favor. But when Brandy demanded that he get out of the car, Matthew got the idea to find out what it felt like to take another person's life. Though his lawyer later said it was an impulsive decision by a man who had been on a 2-day drinking binge and couldn't control his emotions. Vaca was charged with multiple crimes: murder, attempted murder, kidnapping, sexual assault, though he failed to complete the act, tampering with evidence, and desecration of a corpse. While awaiting trial, he was held in custody without bail. The prosecution sought the death penalty, but Matthew ultimately made a plea deal in exchange for the death penalty being taken off the table. No matter how much the prosecutor insisted on the harshest sentence Vaca deserved for his actions, the girls' families were against it. The parents of the deceased Liz and the surviving Brandy believed they should forgive the criminal. They didn't have the right to take someone's life, as it was all God's will. During the sentencing, Matthew had to sit and listen as the people whose lives he had destroyed shared their feelings. The most emotional victim statement came from Brandy Higgs. She looked into her abductor's eyes and told him everything she thought of him. The girl spoke not for herself, but for her friend, whose life he had taken so easily. Brandy showed incredible courage by testifying against Matthew in court, where she described the entire incident. Her testimony was invaluable, as the defendant didn't plead guilty to all charges. During the trial, Vaca tried to read his own statement, taking responsibility for the crimes, but he was so nervous and stuttered so much that it was read by his public defender. In it, Matthew wrote that he was ready to face the consequences of his actions and would pray for the families he had harmed. At the end of the hearings, the prosecutor told the defendant that he deserved the death penalty, and, if it were up to her, he would be executed. But she also added that a quick death would be a luxury for him, because in prison, Vaca would face harsher punishment, where he would be constantly beaten, humiliated, and abused. His entire life would be lived in constant fear. The prosecutor's speech was emotional, perhaps because she too had children who could have been harmed by the heartless monster. In the end, Vaca was sentenced to life in prison, along with several additional terms for other charges. He cannot appeal his sentence, and he won't be eligible for parole until 2096, when he would be 123 years old. It's unlikely he'll live that long. The judge imposed the maximum possible sentence because he believed Matthew Vaca was dangerous to society, and if his knife hadn't broken on Liz Reiser's body, Brandy Higgs would likely be dead too. The family of the deceased Elizabeth made forgiveness the cornerstone of their response to their daughter's loss. Becky, Liz's mother, wrote a book. Together with her husband, they hold seminars where they talk about their daughter's death and forgiving the person who took their child from them. After Matthew was convicted, Becky and Jeff visited him in prison and prayed with him. They even convinced the man not to take his own life. Apparently, the prosecutor's words were prophetic, and life in prison was tough for him. Only behind bars did Matthew come to understand what he had done. He confessed to Liz's parents that he didn't deserve to live after what he did to their daughter. Brandy Higgs said her immediate goal was to find happiness and move forward. Since then, the young woman has preferred to stay out of the spotlight and not share details about her personal life. She still lives in her hometown of New Philadelphia and works as a photographer. Brandy is happily married and a proud mother of 3 children. Matthew Vaca, who once wanted to know what it felt like to take someone's life, will now regret his inappropriate and horrific desire for the rest of his days and will surely feel what it's like to have his own life taken from him. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.